Hi. We're sitting in the Hatley graveyard, which dates back at least to 1820. And what I'm going to do is I am going to appropriately at least read excerpts. It's a very, very long poem from Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which I'll give you a history of it in a minute. And then what I'm going to do, for the sake of interest, and I'm taking a risk here, right, is I'm going to read excerpts, if not the entire, of my own Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which to some degree is inspired by Thomas Gray's masterpiece.
And this churchyard.
I can't hear you.
And this churchyard, Steve, you wrote it.
Yes, in fact, my wife is informing me that I was sort of inspired by this churchyard. And it's true, it's absolutely true. And anyway, there's some differences between the two versions, which are, without getting too pedantic, I'll try and explain, okay? By the way, just to talk about Thomas Gray, this poem, by the way, was the most popular poem in the English language in the latter half of the 18th century. In fact, and apparently this is true, that General James Wolfe, before he assaulted, it turned out successfully, but not for him, he was killed, assaulted the heights at Quebec, he was heard to say that he would have preferred to have written Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, preferred that to winning the battle of the heights of Quebec. Now, it may be an apocryphal story, but it's quite a story, isn't it? That was how popular it was. And it was also, Thomas Gray, it's a gloomy piece, it's a very purple piece, purpureal piece, twilight. In fact, the poem takes place at twilight, and it would probably be a bit better if the shadows from these giant yew trees in this graveyard, the actual graveyard was called, I believe it's called St. Giles Graveyard, in a place, I think it was in, I've got it jotted down here, St. Giles Parish in Stoke Poges, Buckinghamshire. This way it would be better if kind of the shadows were extending through the graveyard, because it's definitely a twilight piece. However, they're not, okay? Anyway, the other thing is that he was Thomas Gray was sort of grouped together with what we call the graveyard poets. There were three of them, basically, Oliver Goldsmith, William Cooper, and Christopher Smart. And they had a tendency to kind of write poems, among other things, about ruins and graveyards, which of course we still respond to. And that was, or has been identified by some critics, as the beginning of the Romantic movement, right? And it was probably, without getting too sort of kind of general or tedious about it, it probably derived from a sense in the 1750s and 60s and 70s that the old order was coming to an end, right? I guess the old order was the feudal aristocratic hieratic order, and there was the beginning of a new order, right? It was probably had to do with the rise of the middle classes, right? Individualism, okay? So that's an interesting note about it. But it's also true that apart from the fact he lived, that is, Thomas Gray lived in this time, if you will, as we do to some degree, the feeling that the world is coming to an end all the time, right? Like, it's also true that his own background, his backstory was one that would kind of make him particularly talented at melancholy, for example. His parents, he was one of, I think, 12 children, and the only one to survive from infancy. His mother and father hated each other, and the mother abandoned the father because of physical abuse, and the father went mad. So you can see, these are kind of pretty bad beginnings. He had a backstory. Okay. Now the poem, probably some of you remember it. The thing is, it's kind of, it took 5 years to write the elegy. It's kind of this, what you identify as sensuous, romantic language. He almost invented it. I'll read you the first couple of stanzas, and then I'll dip into it for you. So. I'll try to do this in my most sonorous voice without being ridiculous. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant foes. Save from that yonder ivy-mantled tower the moping owl does to the moon complain of such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. Beneath those rugged elms the yew trees shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. Now you can see it's kind of like the language is extraordinary, sort of sensuous and musical. It sounds like an old oak barrel rolling down a cobbled street hill. You know, it's very kind of funereal, right? And I'll run through this poem quickly, not too quickly, but I'll hop, right? So there, right, he establishes it's twilight, right? The light is drawing back, right? The sounds of evening are there, right? And he's in a graveyard. He's in a graveyard, right? So, and then he contemplates the tumuli, the mounds he's just addressed. For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envied kiss to share. Okay, so it's all over for them, right? It's all over for them. But they're sort of, who are these people, right? They're nobodies. We're all nobodies. They're obscurities, right? He's in a country graveyard. You know, this isn't London, right? This is not where prime ministers are buried. This is where the yobs are buried, right? So, but and this is where this is a change of sensibility. He's interested in the yobs, right? You know, in the ordinary people. And that's the romantic movement, right? So he says, about the people in the grave, let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur here with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. So he's on the side of the ordinary guy, right? But then he goes on to say that, and this is a kind of a class consciousness, right, which is emerging, because often the romantics, and he was fairly middle class. I think his mother was a milliner, and I don't know what his dad did, but it was something pretty plebeian, you know, at least in terms of the nobility, the upper classes, okay. You know, then he sort of thinks that, you know, and this is social consciousness emerging. He sort of thinks, well, like they may be yobs, you know, but then they get the chance to be anything else, you know. And who knows what, you know, if they'd be able to get an education, right? Who knows what they would have become? It suddenly occurs to him, you know, that maybe an awful lot of human talent is being wasted in this highly stratified and elite system. Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or walked to ecstasy the living lyre. So maybe, you know, maybe a lot of talent has been wasted here, right? But then he goes on to say, and he talks about some of the great, the great dignitaries of the period. They may have become one of these. Hampden, by the way, was Oliver Cromwell's buddy, right? And of course, Milton, the greatest poet, of the previous period. Some village Hampden, they could have been a village Hampden that with dauntless breast the little tyrant of his fields withstood. Some mute, inglorious Milton here may rest, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. And then just their lot forbade them becoming this, right? You'll begin to hear some phrases here which you've heard before, right? Okay. So he starts talking about these nobodies now in the graveyard. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learnt to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Yet even these bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh, even they get gravestones, even though they're nobodies, right? With uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculpture decked, implores the passing tribute of a sigh. They do, right? And a normal feeling person, will sigh over the inscriptions of the graveyard, right? Their name, their years, spelt by the unlettered muse, the place of fame and elegy supply, and many a holy text around she strews that teach the rustic moralist to die. Okay. And then I'll go a little further, okay. For thee, who mindful of the you're mindful of the unhonored dead. You just don't just go to visit the the graveyards of the aristocrats. For thee, though mindful of the unhonored dead, dost in these lines their artless tale relate. He's talking about himself now. If chance by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate. Haply some hoary-headed swain may say, oft have we seen him at, this is him wandering the graveyard, oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. That's a hayfield, the lawn. There at the foot of yonder nodding beech that wreathes its old fantastic roots so high, his listless, this is the guy who's come sort of, for melancholy onto the graveyards, his listless strength at noontime would he stretch and pour upon the brook that babbles by. Okay, so he's sort of suggesting that maybe he's a rather morbid character, right, sort of doing this, right, which he is, of course, And and then one morning I missed him on the customed hill. This is the character who's wandering the graveyard. Presumably this is another point of view. One morn I missed him on the customed hill along the heath and near his favourite tree. Another came, nor yet beside the rill, nor up the lawn, nor at the wood was he. The next with dirges dew in sad array, slow through the churchway path we saw him borne. Dead. Okay. Approach and read, for thou canst read the lay graved on the stone beneath yon aged thorn. This is his epitaph. Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown. Fair science frowned not on his humble birth, and melancholy mocked him for her own, etc. So it's kind of interesting, you see. It's kind of this rollicking sort of, purpureal sort of romantic language, right? But it's actually also about kind of a new way of looking at the world, right? From the bottom up instead of from the top down, right? And of course it was so original at the time. And of course, needless to say, it was of course the very aristocrats who were at the top who loved it, right? Which is always the paradox, right? Okay. You who can read, quote unquote, right? And it basically took certainly England and probably the world by storm, right? Because what they really loved was the music, the kind of, it's like a kind of, I don't know what it is. It's like a vast plate of mixed decaying fruit or something with brandy on it. They just loved it. They just loved it. However, the true romantics, right, the young Wordsworth, right, Wordsworth, Keats, and Coleridge, were not so fond of it, right? Wordsworth, of course, who is perceived as a real romantic, and to us, when you read Wordsworth, it sounds pretty kind of florid and purpureal, doesn't it? But compared to this stuff, right, it's sort of mixed with 2 or 3 cans of water, right? Like, Wordsworth couldn't stand it. Wordsworth basically thought that, it committed the major sin of essentially expanding the gulf between prose and poetry, i.e. between natural spoken language and between poetic language. Because you read Wordsworth and you say, well, doesn't he do that? Well, by our standards, but not by his standards, right? So he didn't like it for that reason. And it was just too florid for words, And anyway, I'm sitting up there on the bench at twilight, and the shadows are extending. And suddenly it strikes me, I'm sort of almost doing exactly the same thing that Thomas Gray was doing in 1751, right? And so I wrote a poem, and it's shorter, fortunately for you, and it's though it has some length. And what I try to do, you'll notice it's not in rhyme, and it's free verse, and it's Wordsworth would have liked it probably, because it seems like spoken language. He would have basically probably said that it's too idiomatic, But anyway, better get the right coffee. And I tried to kind of, whereas I wasn't satirizing Gray's poem, I was trying to think what he would write if he actually saw what you actually see today, right? I.e. what you'll see, And I tried to some degree, in the sections, and you'll see the echoes of it, echo some of his sections and some of his contemplation about, the life and the death of obscurities and how they too may have had talents and all that sort of stuff. After reading Thomas Gray's great Elegy, last glimmering light draws back, following the sun behind the hairline horizon, and the day dims. At the village's end, on the high lookout bench, I sip coffee from a mug and take in the view. Off southwest, a crown of blue mountains darkens to profile. On the stretch of intervening plateau, the lights of farm homes flare up and wobble. Much nearer, in a neighbor's pasture, a steer and another bellow shrilly. Maybe edge yet, skulking along the woodline coyotes. On the 2-lane hardtop winding uphill my way, a manure spreader with the holding tank monstrous in the vehicle's floodlight roars home, trailing stink, before leaving the world to darkness and to me echoing. The noise is mostly cricket stitch, and free now that it's fall of the small motor whine of converging mosquitoes. Behind, on my left, from the village cemetery, with its huge spreading maples, comes a soft snort. I spot a deer's slim-legged and round-bellied silhouette, bending to the grass beside some villager's grave. Whose? In that now shadowy portion, there's a cluster of markers, both older and recent. A few festooned with solar candles and plastic flowers, others plainer, of farmers and their wives, of craftsmen and tradesmen, and youths sadly cut off. Is the plot new, fresh turned? Maybe old man Drew's. He was paid by the village to cut grass fronting the church, and also in the graveyard behind it. He'd done the job for years. Maybe past 80 he wasn't thinking so clear, or because he'd just lost his wife, he neglected to trim a slope with his usual care, and his ride-on mower rolled. A not so quaint end for the longest, oldest villager here. one with a life and experience as valid as any, who after work went home evenings to his wife and a warm wood stove where, still young, his kids, ignoring TV for a moment, chatted happily around him. Though later, on a freezing October night, like one soon to come, his eldest son, speeding back from town with some beer-drinking buddies, hit an iced-up curve, lost it, and plunged into a roadside pond and drowned. A fully lived life for humble Lester, and also grief-swept. Born in loftier circumstances, might old man Drew have been a Pierre Trudeau or a freedom-loving Nelson Mandela, or even, for once, give thanks to social inequity, a would-be tyrant checked by his humble origin? Hard to tell. For Lester, did being destined to dwell outside the city's hubbub and dog-eat-dog in the more laid-back country, or as a city kid boarding at our place glumly phrased it, among the goddamn cows, balance out the lack of recognition and choice. On the other hand, the stone might be Maud Pellerans, who back in the 1930s taught school here in Hatley. Her grave is over there, too, under the big dark maple where the deer is chewing grass. It's getting long since Lester's gone, and there's been no new hire. In this small pond of a place, Maud was a lively spirit and superior schoolmarm. Also, she wrote tourist brochures and newspaper articles on local historical subjects, and maybe even who knows, some poetry, though her stone's verse is not hers, but just funerary boilerplate. We all end up here at what a poet friend of mine termed everybody's final address, whether great or small, or regarding this particular burying ground small or smaller. Dust, equally left mute. Though we're inclined hopefully to leave something, a plot to secure our bones, a stone scratched with a few words to move some passerby to muse on our quicksilver simple tale. A weak grab at permanence to win a delay of time's sure sentence. So what's the take-home of all of this? The sins of hierarchy, the pleasure of solo regret and melancholy. The pen is mightier than the tomb. Tour your local graveyard. Well, it's getting brisk out here. Best I head back. There goes that buck over the graveyard wall. You better stay near the village, 'cause it's soon the season. It's even darker since those clouds moved in. I recall a hole in this pasture I'm crossing. The farmer backhoed out a boulder, then for some reason only half filled the pit. Several times I've nearly fallen in. So I try to kind of like deal with contemporary stuff, right? And I try to deal with it in a contemporary way, you see. Anyway, so.
Wonderful language. Wonderful language.
It's different language. It's completely different. It's interesting to see that.
Different, and yet it's not.
And yet what?
And yet it's not.
Well, exactly. It is in a way. Yeah, it's not. I mean, in the sense that the language, the language is completely changed. I mean, when you wrote a poem in the 18th century, nobody spoke like Thomas Gray in the 18th century. The language is certainly the language of poetry, very much influenced by the James Bible, among things, right? Was perceived to be a kind of an exalted language. It was utterance, specialized utterance, right? But the language today, as you all know, most of you who write, it's kind of, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make it so colloquial that it transcends the colloquial, don't you? That's what you're trying to do. But you're still paying attention all the time, though not drawing attention to it, of economy, trying to be as economical as possible, and as physically vivid as possible, and to be musical, but musical in a kind of a lowest, not a high sense, but almost a kind of, well, you know, modernist. I guess it's modernist sense, isn't it? Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of interesting. Anyway, I didn't write this thinking I was going to write a poem like Thomas Gray, or even on the same subject. I started writing a poem about sitting in a graveyard, you know, actually outside the graveyard, and then of course it struck me like a ton of bricks. This had been done before, right? And Thomas Gray would never have used the simile a ton of bricks, you see. Anyway.
But you
But
had
of course,
fun
as you
doing
know,
it. You had fun doing it.
yeah, I did have fun doing it. Also, of course, Maud Pallaran, these are real people, you know, and you know, and just as he's trying to rescue real people from their obscurity, Maud Pallaran, of course, Lester Drew is a real. I talked to him the day before his mower. He's right on mower roll and killed it, you know, and
Yeah, these stories are everywhere. It's not like they just, you know, are
No,
in
no,
that
but-
poem from far away. you
Yeah,
know,
they're not
you
up
know.
there. They're right down there underneath your nose, aren't they? Yeah, that's right.
And you have, everybody has their own and they're close to them to find.
Yeah. I just discovered a story yesterday. You know, just down the road towards the. This is not completely relevant to the highway. You know, the down the 208. You know, there's a place with a bunch of ponds right on the south side of the road. You just drive down towards the highway. They were trout ponds, right? And I was sort of talking to. You know, Bruce started across the road, and I said, you know, like, I said, you know, I saw that place when it went up for sale. I even contemplated buying it, you know. The house was too small, but I liked the trout ponds. And he told me, well, what happened is, like, lightning hit the trout ponds and killed all the fish and put him out of the business. I said, lightning hit his trout ponds? I mean, you know, kill all the trout? I mean, it's so bizarre that you would never think anything of it. But that's the sort of, you hear these strange...
It's enough to think you're being targeted by the universe.
That's right. True. I mean, it's kind of... I mean, I can see, sweetie, you were saying how your mother's father was put out of the beef industry on the prairies because, you know, I don't know, the hoof and mouth disease killed the cattle, but lightning hitting your trout ponds, that one I've never heard.
There's something in between here. Like, I was surprised, but enjoyed how it ended, you know.
Yeah, it sort of ends up with sort of a kind of, I'm not sure about it. It's so kind of like, when I sort of kind of mention, you know, like, what's the take-home of all this, right? Sort of kind of like, in some ways I'm sort of...
Don't fall in the pit yourself.
Yeah, I'm sort of being ironic. Oh, yeah, well, of course that means I'm the pit, so I'm going in too. Yeah, that's right. Which is, but there is a pit in the field, you know, where the boulder has been removed, you know.
Well, it makes perfect sense of the story, but then it has that, you know, we can imagine, and it's almost sort of, when you hear of these different deaths, you know, in tragic stories, it makes you feel like we're all likely to win a Darwin Award or something in the end.
That's right, the Darwin Award. That's right. Who knows how you're going to go, right?
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. Anyway, well, thank you for listening to it. It's,
So you're musing on everybody else, but in the end, you know, the last thought is, whoop,
yeah,
don't, like,
watch your
lose
feet.
myself right into this.
Watch your feet. Yeah, that's right. It's sort of like, yeah, I know. Well, graveyard, that's, I think, you know, back to the Romantics, I think that one of the things about the emergence of Romanticism is that people began to see themselves as individuals and not as collectives. And once you start seeing yourself as an individual, you start contemplating your own mortality, don't you? And I think and I think that's why, you know, graveyards and ruined castles and stuff like that became very significant, you know. Of course, that really hasn't changed at all. We're maybe post-romantics, but we're still romantics. We're maybe rheumatic romantics or something like that. Yeah, that's right.
Romantic.
Yeah.
What ended the romantic?
Well, modernism did, but obviously, I mean, this is modernistic, but obviously it still has romantic elements, doesn't it? I mean, the very fact that I would write a poem, you know, which in some ways is dealing with the same issues as the Romantics, but kind of putting it in another argot, so to speak, I'm still dealing with the same individualist anxieties and concerns, aren't I? Yeah. The postmodernists, right, kind of, they feel that they've moved beyond those concerns in the sense that they feel that, you know, that the language, linguistic expression is so important, right, that the real issue is not what it's talking about, right, in a sense, subject matter. It's the kind of implicit values, etc., which are actually in the language that deals with it. So it's a philosophical approach to the medium, right? So, for example, a postmodernist, confronting, and I know one who did precisely this, right? Confronting a classroom of students where they're writing lyrical poetry, which of course most of them will be, this sort of, my sort of stuff, kind of looked at it and sort of said, I'm not interested in that stuff, I'm not interested in what you think are your feelings, right? I'm interested in how you narrate and how you present your feelings, because you think that your feelings are governing your expression, but your expression is governing your feelings, right? So the other way around completely, and I want to get you out of that expression so that you can look at the world in a fresher, revolutionary way.
Because everything we think is like, we're thinking from the narrow confines of our,
that's
our
right.
own ego and
our epistemology. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
we're thinking from our. I was just reading a George Saunders book on writing. We happen to be at the center of the story in our mind. So
that's right. We just assume that that's the reality.
So all the thinking that comes from that is just more of the same.
So what would be a postmodern version of Elegy?
Well, you wouldn't write this if you were
multiple narrators.
Multiple, and probably what you could do is you could maybe sort of take the language, break it down, and present it at random in sort of sections, probably, where you're putting sort of kind of like Dadaist sections or something like that. Something you're trying to. I mean, the idea would be to somehow break your epistemological approach, right? So kind of. I don't know whether it's actually
to jam the.
Yeah. I don't know what's actually possible, though. Yeah, I don't know. Obviously possible to some degree. I mean, that's, the famous Dadaist technique of taking a poem, cutting it into sections of phrasing, put it into a brown paper bag, and shaking it up and pulling bits out bit by bit. Right?
I did that to my students and asked them to see if they could try putting it in an order, and then we compared it with the...
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? You get some very interesting stuff. I had a friend who did that quite regularly, and he got one poem where the first line was, using the paperback technique, yesterday's soldier, ambassador to the ground.
Wow.
It's a heavy line, isn't it? That came out at random, yeah.
It seems like, a bit of like disorder is good for the poetry, but not 100%.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that. Yeah, disorder up to point is very good, I think. Yeah. Well, you like to do didn't you? Not montages. Collage. Yeah, you like collage. Yeah. I've never done collages, but yeah. Anyway, am I being too pedantic or pretentious? Am I being too pedantic and pretentious?
That tree behind you, isn't it gorgeous?
I love that. Yeah, pretentious in the cemetery.
Good tree, eh?
Yeah.
Good tree, eh?
Good tree.
In England, in the graveyards, as you can imagine, this is a 200-year-old graveyard. You imagine if you've got a 600-year-old graveyard and you've got yew trees, they're gigantic. They're like the trees, some of those trees in the squares in the temples in China, they're 1,000-year-old trees with some... Oh, they're wonderful, wonderful trees, yeah.